Can you just make an announcement?
If you'd like a coffee, you can walk it
So anyway. It's new. You're fine. No, you're fine. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Ron Henninghockey. I'm the Chief Medical Officer here, and while everyone's still getting their food and kind of getting settled, I thought I would check and see how many of you are here for the first time. Yeah, okay. Thought I might give you just a little background about the Riordan Clinic. I'm a family physician, trained at Wesley Hospital and did my family practice training in Salina, and I've been here working with Dr. Riordan when he was alive and now for another 10 years, so a total of 28 years. And so the Riordan Clinic is really dedicated to the proposition that in this day and age, one of the best investments you can make is learning how to take better care of yourself. The problem that people run into, I mean, I think most people agree that, yeah, I want to be healthier, I want to do the right thing. The problem is finding out what is the right thing to do. And unfortunately, we live in an era of fake news and alternative facts, and in the field of fats, it's no different. Ironically, it all started back in 1955 when Eisenhower had a heart attack. Now, anyone here in the audience around at that time? Yeah. And so there was kind of a new thing, a heart attack epidemic that was going on at that time, and there was quite a bit of concern about what's causing it, because back in the early 1900s, heart disease was a rare thing, and all of a sudden it just started popping up and becoming a huge issue. We just all take it for granted, but there was a time when it was not a problem. And so there was a lot of confusion about what to do. And there were people that stepped forward and offered the dietary hypothesis, which basically said that hydrogenated fat or saturated fats are causing heart disease, and cholesterol is the cause, and so therefore we've got to change the diet. And there was a whole national movement, the McGovern Committee, and all kinds of things happened that shifted people's thinking, and there did come a point where everyone was getting their cholesterol checked and the low-fat foods, and this was the problem. We've discovered the answer. Here's your meds to lower your cholesterol. And lo and behold, in the last, I don't know, we'll find out in just a few minutes here, the real story. Dr. Jackson's going to tell us the real story, but we found out that, wait a minute, this diet that we have condemned was the diet that the healthy farmers were eating all along. Butter and eggs and healthy meats and, these kinds of things maybe weren't the cause. Maybe there was some problems with the way the research was done, and maybe we all got kind of led astray. So the exciting thing is, and I've been telling my patients this, is that good fat is back. Who likes butter? Yay! Eggs turn out to be a really good thing. A lot of clean foods, clean meats turn out to be one of the best things you can eat. But I think we need to know the science behind it, and we need to know maybe what happened. How did we go so far afield, and what can we do to get ourselves back on track? Now, one little take home that you can do today, if you're a little bit skitsy, because for a lot of people, they just grew up on the idea that fat is the bad guy. But if you're a little bit skitsy, I want to just give you one new interesting fact. Who has heard about type 3 diabetes? Okay, so just for those of you that haven't, we now know that people who are having trouble with their memory, brain fog, and in more advanced states, Alzheimer's and dementias of various kinds, what happens is their brain cells actually become resistant to sugar. And so it's a type of insulin resistance diabetes, if you will, type 3. It hasn't totally caught on yet, but people are talking about it. And so what is the alternative pathway? If you can't get sugar into your brain very well, what would be the other pathway that would feed your brain? Medium chain triglycerides, namely ketones. And so for those people, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, if they were starving or if they were out hunting and they didn't have any glucose or carbs, they could survive just upon ketones. And so what we have in the back is something called bulletproof coffee, for those of you that instead of putting milk in it or cream and no sugar, though, I don't know, do we have stevia back there, Ann? We have a little stevia for those who need a little sweetener. There's a gentleman who was struggling with his weight and struggling with his memory, struggling with performance, and he found that he was actually over in India, and he discovered that they were using yak butter in hot coffee, and it tasted wonderful. So he had the idea of blenderizing in butter and something very special called brain octane. It's a type of coconut oil derivative that's very rich in ketones that feeds the brain. So for those of you that would like to try a little bit of what he calls bulletproof coffee, it's a way to kind of help you feel good about fats again and see the difference that it can make in terms of your thinking, your mental performance, and in the long run, helping your brain start to function with less inflammation and less insulin resistance. So that's a long introduction. Dr. Ann, do you want to come up and introduce? Dr. Ann Zahner is one of our doctors here, and she's going to introduce our speaker, and I want her to just kind of tell you how she came to be acquainted with Dr. Jackson.
Coffee. There's some in the back, and we can bring some around if you'd like to try it. It'll help you think during this lecture and absorb all this wonderful information that Dr. Jackson's going to give us today. My first introduction to Dr. Jackson was actually at the Food is Medicine class that we have here, and she came up after and introduced herself and said that she worked with internal medicine residents at KU, which my first thought was, this is amazing that, here we have a doctor that's teaching other doctors that's here learning, about alternative medicine, so that she can better educate her students. And she also was connected with my brother, who's an internal medicine doctor, when he was at KU, and I texted him, and immediately he texted me back, and he's like, oh, Dr. Jackson is absolutely the best. She's wonderful. And so I could go on, and she's an amazing physician, but what I think is most interesting about her is she and her family actually have a farm that they grow or they raise grass-fed meat. And so not only does she practice this, in medicine, but also lives this in their lifestyle. And so I'm sure she'll talk a little bit more about that. But they have the Jackson family farm here in Wichita where they sell all of their grass-fed meat. And so to me, there's no better way to practice what you preach than to actually live it like that. So please help me welcome Dr. Jennifer Jackson. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yes.
Oh, yay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to try not to spill this awesome coffee. Listening to the introduction, I was laughing because I actually gave a talk on the history of the low-fat dietary guidelines. I can't imagine a better introduction. And I realize that I'm probably speaking to the choir here. I feel like I'm very much among friends. When I usually deliver this message, it's typically to Western trained medical doctors, and there's a lot of silence in the audience. So, so hopefully you'll find this information helpful. I'm going to start with an introduction slide, just so you kind of know my background and where I'm coming from. My husband and I were high school sweethearts. We've been together for a long time. I can't quite remember how long we've been married, but I know we've been together for 29 years this year. I don't know how many of you are Game of Thrones fans. Anyone? Okay, so you know Khaleesi. Sometimes I make my residents call me Khaleesi. She's the mother of dragons, and she has 3 dragons. I also have 3 dragons. I have Kyler, my oldest son, is 20. He's at K-State. He's going to save the world through politics. He's currently has an internship up in Topeka and is working with Cindy Carlin, and he's going to change the world. My daughter is 17. She's has her eye on medicine. And then I have a straggler. His name is Brett. He's 11. And he's either going to join the rebellion against Darth Vader and the Imperial forces, or he's going to be a chicken farmer. He's not sure yet. So, as Dr. Ann said, my husband and I really jumped over the ledge a few years ago and decided to start a farm. We have 0 farming experience, so we thought that made total sense. We kind of landed on this 40-acre property, and I'd read too many books by Michael Pollan and Joel Salatin. And so we actually, for those of you who know that literature, we actually went to Polyface Farms and spent a couple days with Joel Salatin and fangirling. But anyways, learned rotational grazing, pasture-based models for animal care. And we said, yeah, sure, we can do this, no problem. So we have grass-finished beef, we have bees, we have pastured chickens, and of course pastured layers. And then we recently took on a couple of pigs. They're going to have their one bad day actually tomorrow, so we'll be saying goodbye to them. And then in the meantime, I do climbs, Colorado 14ers. Anyone do that? No takers. Okay, so that's just my hobby I started recently, so that's kind of fun. I kind of listed out just what I do here in the community. I am an associate professor of internal medicine at KU. That means I get to teach the upcoming great minds in Kansas, medical students and residents in internal medicine. I work both at the hospital and at the outpatient clinic, which is fun and always changing. I also run a few programs for Via Christi. I run the heart failure and transitional care programs, pulmonary rehab, and then I also do some hospice. And then I just started officially training at Cleveland Clinic's Institute for Functional Medicine. So I'm pretty excited about that. I think that that's probably going to be my path moving forward. So this is these are objectives today. I'm sorry about the R's. I'd had a little bit too much bulletproof coffee when I put the slide in this morning. And I just got really excited with the thesaurus. So we are going to reflect on the current dietary recommendations from the American Heart Association. I'm going to pick on them a little bit today. And we're going to review the literature on saturated fats and heart disease, reveal factors that might be influencing their recommendations. We're going to reclassify food today as a nutrient and information delivery package that interacts with our genes. So I want you to keep that in mind. And then we're going to ruminate on diets from an evolutionary and biological standpoint, and then recommend broad-based recommendations about a lifestyle that might help promote healthy eating. All right. So if you went to the American Heart Association website and you looked at their dietary recommendations, this is what you would find. It's a really neat website. You should go. It's very pretty. But this is what they recommend. That you eat a variety of fruits and vegetables, that you eat whole grains, that you eat dairy products that are low fats, that you eat fish and chicken that have their skins removed, that you eat nuts and legumes. Legumes are like beans. Non-tropical vegetable oils. Apparently they don't like the Bahamas. And that you limit saturated fats, trans fats, sodium, red meat, sweets, and sugar-sweetened beverages, and that you eat things, if you choose to eat red meat, you're very bad, but you should eat lean cuts if you choose to do that. And so what's the overall message here? It's low fat, right? And I have to tell you, I was shocked. So the reason I even looked at these recommendations is Maria Loving from Via Christi Life asked me to comment on an article, and it had to do with childhood obesity, but they referenced the guidelines. And so I went to the guideline page to see what they said, and I read this, and I was like, what? What? I was like, this is so 1980s. Like, this is what I grew up with, right? Low-fat Oreos, 6 ounces of pasta. It's low-fat, right? It's good. It's good for me. And I thought we were so beyond this. And I thought, my goodness, I am either like really far out in left field and all this literature I've been reading is like debunked, or something else is going on. And so that's really why I designed this original talk that I gave at the cardiovascular symposium last year. Was just, I got to look into this for myself because I'm very confused if this is what they're recommending. And so they go on to tell you in more detail what to do. They, again, with the fish and the poultry, and take off their skins. Hitting the fish, we're not very fish friendly here in landlocked Kansas. We don't have very much salmon or trout or herring in our waterways. Back to the low-fat dairy, they call out partially hydrogenated vegetable oils and trans fats, and then they actually name, you should replace saturated fats with monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fats. Just to give you a food reference, monounsaturated fats, people usually think of olive oil. Polyunsaturated fats, people tend to think of vegetable oils. But with polyunsaturated fats, you have lots of different types. There's the omega-3s and omega-6s, and you get into all that kind of stuff. And then very specifically, if you need to lower your cholesterol, this is how you do it. Okay, versus this, right? Time Magazine, June 2014, butter is back. So what is going on here, right? What is going on? So this is what I did. I turned to the literature, and for those of you who aren't familiar, PubMed is kind of the repository for all of the medical articles, all the peer-reviewed journal articles that get published. You can find them in PubMed. And so you can go in there and you can search whatever you want. And so I looked at saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. What does it say? And I looked specifically for meta-analyses. And what these are big studies that look at all 20 or 25 or 60 studies that have to do with your question, and they compare the answers, and they come up with a recommendation. Are there any trends? I looked over the past 5 years, and initially came up with 110 titles, but then I limited it to dietary trials, not drug trials. Well, it's not very popular to do diet trials because there's no money in it, right? And so this is what I came up with, and we're going to go through each one of these. All right, so 2014 Annals of Internal Medicine. These are big journals. These are the kind of the backbone journals for medicine. So they looked at fatty acid intake and then biomarkers. What is that? Well, that's an intermediate risk for heart disease. So they're looking at inflammatory markers. And then changes, and when you change the fat, what happens to those things? 20 trials met their inclusion, and they didn't find any association between a diet that was high in saturated fat and heart disease. Okay, so no association in these 20 trials. 2014, British Medical Journal, another study, they looked at if you reduced your saturated fat, what happened on cardiovascular events, so heart attacks, cardiovascular mortality, so if you died from a heart attack, or dying by getting hit by a bus or any other reason, okay, all-cause mortality. Only 12 studies met their inclusion criteria. Again, no risk reduction for events were associated with lowering your saturated fat. So they lowered the fat and it did nothing in these 12 trials. 2015, British Medical Journal, studied intake saturated fat and specifically cardiovascular mortality. And so this was like heart attacks, strokes, those types of things. 12 studies specific to saturated fat. This is a pretty big trial. There was actually 3 separate questions that they looked at. I pulled out just the information on the saturated fat study, so the 12 trials. No association between saturated fat, death, due to heart disease or cardiovascular disease at all. Moving on to Cochrane. Now, Cochrane is a database that's supposed to be known as uninfluenced by industry. So they're supposed to be these people that are sequestered in some white tower somewhere, maybe surrounded by orcs, that are supposed to be the brainiacs, okay? And you're supposed to be able to look to them for anything that's evidence-based. And so Cochrane is a pretty common place to look for information. So they looked at the reduction in saturated fat and the risk of cardiovascular events, 15 trials. Now they found a 17% relative risk reduction of cardiovascular disease, okay, but there was no effect on cardiovascular or all-cause mortality. So what does that mean? Stats are, yeah, I rock stats. Not really. So relative risk, absolute risk. When you look at trials and they use language and they tell you there's a 50% reduction in something, they're talking about relative risk. And I'm going to just try to explain this with this example. So if a person had, if this young lady over here has a 2 in 20 chance of getting breast cancer by the time she reaches 60, and I give her this drug and it reduces her risk by 50%, that's a relative risk reduction. That is, it sounds amazing, right? There's a 50% reduction in her getting breast cancer. Man, I would want to sign up for that. But that's 50% relative to the two. So it went from a risk of 2 in 20 to 1 in 20. And that's the absolute risk. So now her absolute risk went from 2 in 20 to 1 in 20. Does that make sense? So absolute risk is kind of a better way to talk, but that's not how the medical literature tends to talk. We tend to talk in relative risk. So a relative risk of 17% sounds like a lot. I don't know. All right, interestingly, Cochrane in 2012 published the same analysis with the same study question. This time they had 48 studies that met their inclusion criteria. Now, if you'll remember before, it was somewhere around 12. Now it's 48. And when they looked at 48 studies in 2012 with the same question, they found that the reduction in saturated fat did not alter cardiovascular events, mortality, or all-cause mortality. Okay, so those are all of the studies in the past 5 years that look at this question. And I can't see any really big difference in lowering my saturated fat intake. Moving on. Cholesterol has been, that's the big link, right? That's how we think. You eat fat, you eat cholesterol, it increases the risk of blockages in your heart, and that's the cause of all that. And this is the classic diet heart hypothesis, right? You consume this stuff, up goes your cholesterol, you clogged up the pipes, and now you're going to have a heart attack. That's what we've been thinking, and that's what we've been telling people for at least 30 years. So the original study that created the diet heart hypothesis was published 35 years ago. There it is, 1968, 1973. Establishing that hypothesis. In 2016, just last year, the British Medical Journal actually published a follow-up article. They had uncovered new data from that original study that had never been published. Shocking. And guess what it showed? When they actually looked at all of the data together, there was no change in cardiovascular disease by changing saturated fat. What they actually did is they took people and they had one group where they had a certain percent of saturated fat. The other group, they replaced the saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, i.e. vegetable oil, okay? And they followed these people over time. And so what they showed is not only was there no decrease in the people that ate the higher saturated fat diet, there was actually an increased risk for harm in the patients that were consuming the polyunsaturated fat or the vegetable oils. And I have it on the slide for you. There was an increased risk of death for every drop of cholesterol by 30 milligrams per deciliter. So every time they lowered their cholesterol, they increased the risk of death. What? This is mind blown, right? This totally kind of, what is going on? Oh my gosh. Well, guess what? Maybe our bodies are a little bit more complex than just cholesterol in, cholesterol out, right? You know, cholesterol is pretty complex. I grew up with cholesterol is bad. We should not eat cholesterol, but cholesterol is very important for many pathways in the body. There's different types of cholesterol. Everyone's heard the LDL is the loser cholesterol and HDL is the happy cholesterol. In fact, I taught that to my patients, right? But there's different types of LDL. And some don't do much harm, and then some are kind of the villains. Most cholesterol panels don't look at the difference. They just give you a big number. This is a slide that kind of represents the beginning of understanding of the difference between the LDL, loser cholesterol particles. Some are called large or fluffy, and they just kind of hang out. They're like Fat Albert. They just kind of hang out and they don't do anything, right? Then there's the small guys, and these guys wiggle into any cracks that you have in your blood vessels, and they tend to be inflammatory, and we don't want inflammation. Inflammation in your blood vessel is a bad deal, and these tend to be pro-inflammatory, and the other word for that is pro-atherogenic. They start forming plaques because when they hang out. Also, it depends on the delivery system. So not to get into too much biochemistry, but we kind of touched on there's different types of fats, right? We talked about the polyunsaturated fats that tend to be kind of vegetable oils. Depending on the balance of those and how they're processed, they affect your cholesterol differently. So they may lower your LDL, but they also may lower your HDL. Saturated fats, they do increase your LDL, but the LDL that goes up is the large, fluffy, non-inflammatory LDL, and it actually increases your HDL. Refined carbohydrates, so think of anything that comes in a box, right? So your cookies, your crackers, your cakes, your breads, those things that are really, really refined, they increase those small, dense, mean, atherosclerotic LDL particles. They also increase your triglycerides, and that's the pathway to what we call insulin resistance, which is also known as prediabetes. I love this article. So this was published a couple of years ago, and it was a dietary review article going over all of the evidence for these studies, and basically the author called out the American Heart Association, saying that, you know what, it made sense in the past that we had some evidence that kind of associated saturated fat and cholesterol with heart disease. But we have clear evidence now that shows us that we were mistaken, that we oversimplified things. And to hang on to these recommendations, she called it cognitive dissonance. I'm just going to quote her. Health promotion groups in some countries appear to suffer from cognitive dissonance and continue to promote an outdated and potentially hazardous dietary recommendation based on invalidated hypotheses. So why is the American Heart Association sticking to the old dogma? And that was my next question. I just couldn't understand. I'm like, I'm not an evidence-based medicine expert, but it seems pretty clear that the current evidence does not support the original hypothesis. So I started to look into those questions a little bit further. And unfortunately, what I found is there's the influence of money and politics. And I wish, we didn't have to think about this, but unfortunately we do. So in September of last year, it was uncovered that some of the original research with the diet heart hypothesis came from someone from Harvard School of Medicine, Dr. Hegsted. He was very adamant and very passionate that fat was the cause of heart disease. But in the 50s and early 60s, some literature started coming out that sugar was pro-inflammatory, and we understand that inflammation is really the key to understanding a lot of our chronic diseases. And so sugar was starting to be linked with heart disease. Well, the Sugar Research Foundation, you can imagine, they're responsible for selling their product, right? So they actually hooked up with Dr. Hegsted and paid him money to develop research that spoke against the sugar heart hypothesis. And so he was able to publish data that said sugar wasn't a villain at all, and that fat was truly to blame for heart disease. This was just uncovered this last fall and was published in JAMA. When we look specifically at the American Heart Association, they also have some ties to industry. They actually developed a program called the Heart Check program. Is anyone familiar with this program? Very good. So what happens is companies pay the American Heart Association to get their Heart Check stamp of approval. Okay? And so there's an initial fee to become enrolled, and then there's every year you have to pay your dues to continue to get your Heart Check stamp of approval, and you'll find them on the box of products. These are the requirements, and I know that's kind of a messy slide, but what you'll see is it's very much centered around the low fat. Okay, so this is an example. So this is Yoplait Greek strawberry yogurt, and if you read the label, it has 18 grams of sugar in a serving. And this has the Heart Check stamp of approval. This would meet criteria. The avocado is on the other side, and we think of avocados as a very nutrient-dense, health-promoting food, but it would not meet the heart check stamp of approval because of the amount of fat that it has. So the manufactured yogurt with tons of sugar is A-okay, and the avocado you got to leave alone. This is Dr. Eckel. He's the past president of the American Heart Association. He's pretty influential in terms of industry. He actually sat on the 2013 guidelines to treat blood cholesterol. And these are the national recommendations that physicians follow to make a decision about whether or not to start a cholesterol-lowering medication called a statin. And when these recommendations came out, they kind of changed the way we look at patients. So I was real excited at first. It sounded good. It's, instead of targeting a number, we used to chase LDL numbers, we now targeted risk. Well, that kind of made sense. Until you looked at the specifics, what it did is it basically doubled the number of patients now eligible or recommended for statin therapy. And the risk assessment scores that they use are maybe not quite evidence-based, the calculator that they use. In fact, if you had absolutely no risk factors at all and you're a man, by the time you're hit about 69 or 70, you should be on a statin. It turns out that Dr. Eckel sits on advisory boards that advise the Food and Drug Administration, and he gets money from those companies. Pfizer and Merck, who are the makers of some of the statin medications, sat on the advisory committee to advise Dr. Eckel about the recommendations for the statins. And so basically, Pfizer and Merck told Dr. Eckel what they thought should happen in terms of their drugs being recommended for patients. Yikes. I'll tell you, when I read this, I started crying. I was like, you've got to be kidding. These affected millions of people. And really, the guys who sell the drugs are sitting on the advisory committee. Are you kidding me? Aren't we kind of beyond that? Apparently not. All right. So where do we go? Where do we go from here? I kind of felt a little bit let down by the fact that, man, this is like the bread and butter of medicine, and I don't feel good teaching this. So where do you look? Okay. Well, nutrition is difficult. Let me back up. Nutrition is both easy and difficult at the same time. Let's look back from a more global perspective. So what feeds into health? Okay, so I think of these as kind of the pillars of health. Sleep. Oh my gosh, sleep. That is huge. Good, effective sleep. Long enough, right? It's anti-inflammatory. Stress. My dad recently said, what do I have to be stressed out about? He's a 72-year-old bee farmer. He's like, I love my life. Well, there's a lot of things maybe you haven't dealt with 100% yet. We got to work on those things, right? We got to turn off the TV and stop listening to CNN. And maybe there's a colleague that we need to have a conversation with, or maybe there's a family member that we need to forgive. Those are all types of stress. Okay, and those come out. I told him, I said, Dad, you can put a lid on it, but if you don't take the garbage out, it still stinks, right? And he was like, yeah, okay, I get that. Certainly nutrition, big part of it. Physical activity. Everyone hates exercise, but physical activity is a nicer word, right? The gut microbiome, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And then epigenetics. So fun, so fun, so fun. How your individual genome interacts with the environment. So we're going to just touch on a couple of these. Does anyone know what the gut microbiome is? Okay, that gives me a baseline. So you have 1 trillion organisms living inside of you that interact with you every day. You have to think about yourself as a biome. You are an ecosystem. Okay, your body's an ecosystem, and you are growing these things inside of you that talk to you, okay? And your brain listens to them, your liver listens to them, your lungs listen to them, okay? This is called the gut microbiome, and it's made up of lots of bacteria, some other guys too, some yeast and protozoa and all that kind of stuff. And they actually interact with you and your genetic profile, and they help decide how your body's going to react to different things. This discovered 15 years ago, maybe-ish, okay? Didn't really know what to think about it at first, but almost daily there's new articles coming out about what's going on with the gut microbiome. What do we know so far? Well, we know that it affects energy harvest. What is that? It's another way of saying that, you know that girl in high school that could eat all the potato chips she wanted and she was like skinny as a rail, and I like look at the bag of potato chips and I gain 2 pounds? Okay, it affects energy harvest. So 100 calories in one person isn't absorbed the same way as 100 calories in another person. Basal energy expenditure, the other name for that is metabolism. Okay, we know the biome affects your metabolism, the way that your body uses energy. Inflammation, this is a hot topic. We think that the gut is probably the common link to start all these inflammatory processes. Now, inflammation in me may turn my ADD mechanisms on, right? Inflammation in someone else may activate breast cancer. Inflammation in this guy may end up as coronary artery disease. And that all depends on you and your genes and your biology and all those things factored together. But inflammation is probably the key to most of our chronic diseases, and it starts in the gut. The gut-brain connection is very real. There's fascinating things going on with studies on the gut and depression, anxiety, autism, ADHD. All right, so big picture here. Food is more than macronutrients. Okay, this is an avocado, right? But what is an avocado? We talk about it as a good fat. Look at everything else that's in the avocado. It is a nature-derived delivery system of information, okay, that affects your hormones. It affects your biome. Does that make sense? Food is information. Food is genetic manipulation inside your body. And food is nutrition. It's a package, a nature-derived package. That's a lot different than a box of vanilla wafers, right? That's not a nature-derived nutrition package, right? It's a box of sugar, but quality of your food matters, and we need to stop pretending that it doesn't. This I use cows because I'm familiar with them. This is the difference between, you hear a lot about grass finished beef versus grain finished beef. Well, all cows are started on grass, right? They all start off on grass. In our industrialized model, in the last 6 months of life, most of the cattle in this country are moved to something called concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, just drive to Dodge City. You'll smell it before you see it. These are feeding lots where the cows are fed grain, corn and other grain products that are kind of mushed up. The reason for this is because it makes them gain weight quickly. However, cows are herbivores. They really weren't meant to eat grain. And so what happens to the cow's microbiome is it kills the ruminant bacteria. As you know, cows chew, they swallow, they regurgitate, they swallow, they regurgitate. It's kind of gross. But they have specialized systems to do that, and they have specialized bacteria in their guts to handle that. When they don't get the grass that they need, the bacteria die off, and it develops a very acidic environment. What do we know about acid? Anyone ever have heartburn? I mean, yes, nobody here has heartburn. That's amazing. Right. Heartburn is a type of inflammation. It's a type of gut inflammation. And we know that when people have inflammation in their guts, that bad things can happen in their bodies, that it can set off a cascade of inflammation. These cows then are very susceptible to illness, and so they oftentimes need antibiotics to survive. They're not in their natural environments. If you've ever seen one of these, they're pretty much just on dirt, not on grass. They're kind of standing in their own feces, and that pollutes the air. If you've ever driven by with your window down, you know what I'm talking about. Your eyes kind of water. That also happens to the cows. And so in addition to the wellness issues of the cows and what it does to their meats, there's also a lot of environmental concerns, as you know. When you eat an animal raised in these conditions, it's a different type of meat than an animal raised in its native conditions. So, for example, with cattle, when you have a grain-finished animal, that's the vernacular, grain-finished animal, the fat from that animal is a different type of fat. It's a very omega-6 heavy fat. When you have a grass-finished animal, it's a very omega-3 heavy fat. And so I kind of think of it like this. God knew Kansas didn't have any good water sources around it, so he gave us grain-finished beef instead of salmon. That's the way I think of it. Go Kansas. And here's just a picture representation. You can see the little grass is on one side, the little corn is on the other to represent the grain finishing. And can you guys see, can you appreciate in that the difference between, look at the white fatty parts. It's the grain finished beef is more fatty, and if you can, I can't tell if you can appreciate the color on that, but the color of the fat is different, and that's because it is truly a different type of fat. All right, so how do we put all this together? How do I know what to eat for dinner? That's where I get. And this is kind of how I think of it. You take the literature, and we just reviewed the literature on fat. And then we take the biology of the animal and what we know about what were they supposed to be doing, okay, in nature as designed. And then we can look back at what we call ancestral clues, like what do we know from history and what would have been normal before we had all the modern day conveniences. So one tribe that's very heavily studied is the Hasda. This is one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes that exists in the United States. They're in Africa, obviously. So they are part of the microbiome research project where they're studying the gut microbiome of different populations in the world. There's been a lot of articles written about them. And so what do they do? Well, they're hunter-gatherers. They're going to eat whatever they can get their hands on, right? And so what do they end up doing? Well, it depends on the season. They eat seasonally. They eat locally. When they can get meat, and usually in the dry seasons, they tend to eat more meat because the animals tend to come to the one water hole, and so they're easier to catch. In the wet seasons, they tend to eat a lot more starchy tubers that they dig up. The estimates are that these tribes eat over 100 grams of fiber a day from these fibrous root vegetables that they dig up. They eat the whole animal. Right in America, we eat the muscle meats. That's actually the most nutrient poor part of the animal. The most nutrient dense part of the animal is actually the organ meats. These animals didn't eat corn for dinner. They ate grass. They're in their native environment. They're running around, fresh air, fresh water. They eat a lot of bee products. So not only the honey, but you can see they have comb. And I wish I'd brought my bee pictures. My honeycomb has a lot of larvae in it. And those larvae are very high in nutrients, including saturated fat. And they just chomp right in there. I've heard estimates that they can put away like 50 pounds of honey. Go Asda. Another ancestral clue we can look at is the blue zones. How many are familiar with the National Geographic blue zones? Okay. So Dan Buettner and National Geographic, they went out and the plan was there's these places around the world where they have a very high number of I can't say that word, 100-year-old people. Thank you. What are the common things among these groups of people? Okay, why do they live so long? And so he visited all these locations across the world, and he kind of came up with the 9 things that they had in common. So of the 9 things, only 3 of them were food related. Okay, the other 9 had more to do with having an identity, having a tribe, having a purpose. But the 3 food characteristics: don't overeat. Okay, so that kind of 80% full rule. No Thanksgiving dinner for you. Drink red wine. Woohoo! Yay! And then here's the food. Eat. It's a big list. So what is the common theme here? I heard it. Whole foods. Right. No percentages of saturated fat, right? No sugar listings, no total carbs. We're not looking at macronutrient ratios here. We are looking at whole foods, okay? They have animal products, they have saturated fat stuff, they have lots of plant-based foods. That was the common theme. Mediterranean diet. Woo! If I had a nickel for every time I heard about the Mediterranean diet. I look in PubMed. Well, this is from PubMed. There you go. The Mediterranean diet is the popular go-to diet right now. If you want to be cool in medicine and you want to talk about diet, you just say, Mediterranean diet. Yeah, you got to eat the Mediterranean diet. You should do the Mediterranean diet. All right. So what's the Mediterranean diet? Well, I look at these trials. I don't think they know what the Mediterranean diet is, but this is what I finally came up with. It took me a while. High consumption of olive oil, legumes, unrefined cereals, fruits, vegetables, fish, dairy, wine. There's my wine again. All right. So everyone says, oh, it's because they eat a lot of omega-3s. Oh, it's the fish. Oh, it's the lack of saturated fat. But when you read that, what are they eating? They're eating whole foods. And where are they getting their fish? The clue is in the picture. They live on the freaking ocean. Hello. I mean, the fish are right there. They pull them out of the water, right? Their chickens are running around on pasture. They're not in a Tyson factory. They don't have their salmon flown 3,000 miles, frozen 3,000 miles. You're eating it 6 weeks later. I don't know that counts. Does that count? Their salmon isn't raised at a farm eating chow. It's in the ocean. So I think we're missing the picture here. I mean, I'm like, no, that's not it. This is an example of a whole foods diet. Pasture-based, free-range, whole food. Do you see what I'm getting at? I'm not getting any answers. Oh, that's not good. All right, we need another round of bulletproof coffee. So, Michael Pollan, I told you I fangirl Michael Pollan, Joel Salatin. If I can get their names in a few more times, I will. I love him. You are what you eat. That's great. That's great. It gets people thinking about what we're talking about here, right? So let's put it together. So I'm not sure there's one term that really encompasses this whole idea. Plant paleo is a term from Angelo Coppola. He's actually a podcaster. Real interesting guy. He started off at like 280 pounds or something, whatever. And now he's like about as big as a minute and as strong as an ox. And he has a blog post. It's called Humans Are Not Broken. He's really interesting. He went through the literature kind of as it came out. And over time, I listened to him for years. He changed his thinking depending on the literature. And he kind of ended up with this kind of plant paleo diet that he explains. And so what that is it's encompassing a whole foods diet with the ideas of paleo. Paleo is pretty common right now, or it's pretty popular right now. Does paleo anyone get paleo? Okay, so strict paleo is no dairy, no legumes, and your meats are grass-finished, free-range, all that. What I love about paleo is they talk about the quality of the food that you are eating. Okay, so a Tyson chicken and a pastured chicken are completely different types of nutrition. All right, and they recognize that. Dr. Mark Hyman, he has several books out, and he talks about the Pegan diet, which is similar to plant paleo. There's the anti-inflammatory diet. Dr. Wells talks about that. Whole foods diet, clean eating diet. All of these types of diets are, I guess, what I would consider a healthy diet. And a Mediterranean diet is an example of these. All right, so here's my version of it. Focus on food. That should be obvious, but it's not so much anymore. We have all these edible food-like substances that are sold to us packaged in convenience, right? So eating real food. Mostly plants. I think we saw from Blue Zones and even the Haas did that they eat a majority of their food is plant-based. It needs to be properly prepared. There's some, and we'll go through that in a minute. Without pesticides or transgenic modification, and I will hit on that in just a second, and then sustainably raised. If you're going to eat animals, sustainably raised, both for the health of you and the animal and the environment. All right, so going through each one of these, focus on food. If nature made it, it's okay. If man made it, stay away. And I teach this to my kids, right? I was like, well, who made it? Was it made in a lab? Was it made in a factory? Was it put in a box? Or can you find it in nature? And don't eat it if your grandma won't recognize it. Don't eat it if you don't have the ingredients in your pantry. Don't eat it if it doesn't rot, because that's not real food. And don't eat it if sugar is in the top 3 ingredients. And that kicks out a lot of those yogurts, right? And these, you can find more of these from Michael Pollan's food rules. So here's a test. On your left, we have whole wheat flour, high fructose corn syrup. Does anyone have that in their pantry? molasses and yeast, at least I can pronounce them, but then you get down to the sodium sterol lactylate, ethylated mono and diglycerides, calcium dioxide. I won't even go on. I can't pronounce these, much less do I have them in my pantry. So does anybody know what that is a label to? Wonder Bread.
Everything.
On your right, strawberry splash ingredients. We've got low-fat milk, because we want to take out the nutrition from the fat, I guess. And then sugar. Yay! Modified cornstarch, gelatin. I don't have any tricalcium phosphate. But what is the food rule that violates right off the top? What's in the first three ingredients? Yeah, sugar, right? And that is yogurt marketed to kids. All right, so mostly plants. We talk about eating from the rainbow. That has to do with phytonutrients. If you eat all the different colors, you get lots of different nutrients that you need. We do know that the nutrition in our fruits and vegetables is decreasing, and that has to do with the soil health. The soil is being depleted. The soil has a microbiome too, and we're killing it, and so that doesn't bode so well for us. In season, because that's the most nutrient-rich fruit and vegetable that you can find, is if it's picked in season. A strawberry in June is different than a strawberry in December that was picked in Brazil and shipped up here. It has a different nutrition. It's a different food altogether. And then local, we talk a lot about local because number one, again, the nutrient density of the foods. But then if you want to think with eat with an ecological mind, when they have to truck it from California, it's going to lose some of its nutrition, and that's a lot of petroleum inputs. So ideally, that's where you would source your food. The best place to source your food from is your backyard, your garden. So properly prepared. So there's been a lot of talk about legumes, and they have lectins and these anti-nutrients and those sorts of things. I don't know what the answer is for sure on those things, other than I think a lot of people feel like if you soak them, it does increase the nutrients, the available nutrients to the human. They're more easily digested, and it decreases some of those anti-nutrients. I think legumes are one of those personal things where some people do great with them and some people don't. I also know that it's hard to find literature that doesn't show that legumes can be healthy. And then in terms of grains, again, grains are a hot topic too. Wheat itself is very inflammatory in general. I've lost track. I think there's like 27 different pro-inflammatory parts of wheat beyond gluten. If you can tolerate wheat, certainly sprouting and fermenting them increases the nutrient profile, nutrient density of the grains. Grains, same way, I feel like it depends on the person, and some people do great with grains and other people don't. So chemical and GMO free. So glyphosate, which is also known as Roundup, is the most heavily utilized herbicide worldwide. It's made by Monsanto. And there's some studies out there that have linked this to fatty liver disease, obesity, and diabetes in humans. It's definitely linked to the bee colony collapse and the monarch butterfly death. And that's why the GMO project nominated the monarch butterfly as part of their verified program. You'll find these on packages that contain non-genetically modified food. To put that into context, I have to talk a little bit about genetically modified products. GMO is kind of a misnomer. When the press is talking about GMO, what they're really talking about is transgenic crops. And so what the heck is that, right? Okay, so a transgenic crop is they take a piece of DNA from one species and they put it into a different species. So for example, they take a gene from a bacteria and they put it into the DNA of a corn plant. Okay, that's called transgenic modification, right? It creates a new species. Never been seen before, and it couldn't happen in nature. There's a difference between that and cisgenic. Cisgenic is you take something you like from one tomato plant and you put it into another tomato plant and you make a new tomato plant, okay? So the species are the same and you're selecting for something specific and you're splicing it together. Does that make sense? Okay. So when the press is talking about GMOs, they're talking about transgenic modifications. And so what do we have in terms of transgenic modifications? Well, 95% of our soybeans and about 85% of our corn are transgenic. And so most of them produce the ability to resist the herbicide glyphosate. Okay, so what happens is the corn comes up, the farmer can spray their field with glyphosate and they can kill all the other weeds and the corn thrives. Sounds great until your corn becomes resistant. And then we have something called super weeds. Okay, and you see them in Kansas. They're big, tall trees in the middle of an otherwise plowed field. So what's the answer to that? Well, the answer, and I'm going to get on my soapbox. Oh gosh, I can feel it. Less coffee. So then it's to bring out the next poison. So a year ago, fall, the government gave their stamp of approval to what are called 2,4-D terminator seeds. 2,4-D is an herbicide that was in Agent Orange, and that's now being used on your fields near you. So GMOs is kind of a whole nother talk, which I'd love to give if you ask me back. But that's the idea. A lot of people say, well, is genetic modification bad for humans? We don't really know. There have been some examples where it has been bad. There was a Starlink corn is an example, and they created this new corn, transgenic corn. And remember I said that it creates a new species? So it's potentially a new allergen, and that's exactly what happened, is they had created something that was very similar to peanut allergy, and they realized that people could anaphylax. They tried to get a hold of it, but somehow it snuck into the human corn supply, and there were people that did have problems with that. So there's a lot of questions about how it affects human health. We do, however, know that it affects the health of the environment. As they spray these herbicides, they spray more and more as the plants become more resistant, and it gets back to the bees and the monarchs. That's been very well demonstrated in the literature. Yes, ma'am. Talking. Oh, great.
I'm about in a spraying, and I'm driving down. How much is that?
So the question for the online audience is that she lives out and she sees the airplanes coming to spray the herbicides, and how is that affecting her? I always step on the accelerator and I close off my vents and I hold my breath, and I'm just like, oh my God. I hear you. It's scary, isn't it? Yeah. And you see that poison just falling down, and it just makes me sad. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. We fight that with our bees. We have like 55 hives. My dad mainly has the bees, and then I have like 8 or 9 hives. But we're protected all except this one area to our west. The people who own the land rented it out to an alfalfa farmer recently, and he sprayed, and anyways, yeah. It's a thing. So we try to, we know that any spraying is going to be going on. We try to shut our bees in at night, but yeah. Sustainably raised. I talked about CAFOs earlier. On your left is just a picture of a concentrated animal feeding operation for cows. You can see this area here. That's a manure pile. So they just kind of scrape it all up, and then eventually they put it into a big pit. And then we just touched on the nutrient density of the soil. Right now what we do is we clear cut areas, we plant crops. Those crops, they need a lot of nutrition. They take it out of the soil. And so what we do right now is we come back and spray with NP and K to try, those are, minerals to try to put back into the soil. But the soil is much more complicated than just that nutrition. It has a whole life of its own. All right, and so just wrapping up here, I was just going to give some examples. I just threw this in here because I don't know. It was what I was eating that day. So this is my spinach berry smoothie. And so I threw some spinach and blueberries and strawberries and some maca powder because I was kind of grumpy that day, so it tends to help. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, it's kind of gross.
What's microbiome?
So it's a new, oh gosh, I just killed my slides. That's good. Is that better? Okay.
Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, so it's maca is a root, and it's the powder is it's smashed down and given into a substance that you can eat easily, and so it's considered. Can I use the word superfood? I don't use that loosely. It's one of the superfoods. It's recommended for women. I don't. Is it recommended for guys?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And where do you get it?
You know, I get it in a bag at the local grocery stores.
Health food store?
Yeah, I got mine at Green Acres. Overnight oats, I'm usually like running out the door, so that's a way to do some grains. There's a lot of studies out there that say that the oats are anti-inflammatory. I don't eat a lot of them, but I happen to have some that day. Some chia seeds, it has a lot of great fiber in it. We have a lot of honey. There you go. And then when I do have legumes, I use sprouted, and thankfully, Green Acres and Whole Foods and Sprouts and all those places carry pre-sprouted lentils. I used to try to sprout my own, and I would always forget them, and then I'd smell this really funny smell. Yeah. Then they go to the pigs, right? So nothing goes to waste in our house. But anyway, so now I don't even have to worry about that. It's so convenient. And just some good other whole foods. I do make a lot of bone broth from our chickens. So that's fun. A lot of greens. And then got to get my beef in. Yum, yum. Yeah, great question. So the question was, what's the difference between grass-finished and grass-fed beef? So all grass-fed can be a misnomer. All cows are grass-fed in the beginning. Okay, and so if they're finished on grass, that's truly the vernacular you need to look for. All right, and then, I know these dietary recommendations, they get a little overwhelming, and if you're starting from a standard American diet, some people, I'm kind of an all-in person. I just jump, sometimes without looking. But if you are a one-at-a-time person, what steps do you take? Well, sugar sweetened beverages, good Lord, get rid of those. Artificial sweeteners, bye-bye. If you do consume dairy, any raw milk fans out there? That's probably a whole nother lecture, yay. How are you? Yeah, raw milk, definitely want to find a farmer near you. Bread, I can't tolerate grains personally. Bread doesn't have a lot of nutrition in it, to be honest, compared to other foods. But probably, just really good quality breads. And so, if you're just making a sandwich, that's probably not where you want to use your grains. You really want to save them for something awesome. Junk food only if it's homemade, so you can control the ingredients, and you're not going to eat as much if you have to make it. Eating out, only places that share your standards. So when I go out, I don't eat beef, and I don't eat chicken, I don't eat any of that when I go to a restaurant, because I don't know how it's raised. Unless I know the place I'm going to has grass-finished beef or pastured poultry. You want to support the places that are trying to make a movement. The dirty dozen, if you're low on cash, certainly if you're looking at organics, basically organic has to do with not necessarily how something's raised, but the pesticide load. And so the dirty dozen is a nice way to save some money, but support your health. And then, of course, cooking ahead, and then find help. So I'm just going to leave you with this, if it loads there, this quote from former President Obama. He really did get it. I mean, he did. And I read this and I was like, wow, he does. He gets the big picture. So our agricultural system is built on cheap oil, and now our agricultural sector is contributing more greenhouse gases than our transportation sector. And we're creating monocultures that are vulnerable to national security threats. If you wanted to take down this country, you could do it by poisoning the lettuce, because 95% of the lettuce is washed in one sink in California. I hope none of the terrorists were listening to that, right? Makes it vulnerable to food prices and crashes, swings in commodity prices, and is directly related to our healthcare cost expenditures, creeping up our incidence of chronic disease. All right, so preventing heart disease. Eat real food, mostly plants, properly prepared, well raised, local to decrease the food miles and increase the nutrient density. Play, sleep, and get zen. I would love to answer questions.
How do you make?
Oh, great. Yeah, so sorry about that. So the Dirty Dozen are the 12 foods that are most contaminated by pesticides. Think thin-skinned, like apples, berries, grapes, lettuce, things like that. You can look it up online for the complete list. It's called the Dirty Dozen. So those Dirty Dozen foods, you probably want to buy them organic because of the amount of pesticides that they absorb. Great question, thanks. High fructose corn syrup? I do. Do you want me to go through that? So they take the corn and they take it to a lab and they pull out the sugar from it. And then they combine it together to make a new molecule. So compared to table sugar, it just which is fructose also, it has a higher percentage of fructose. There's studies done on high fructose corn syrup and its effects, and then there's questions of how does it affect our gut microbiome, which is really interesting research. There's research coming out that man-made sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup and then artificial sweeteners such as, I can't even think of their names now, NutraSweets and Splenda and those things actually kill your biome. Okay, and they think that that might be one of the pathways by which it increases your risk for developing diabetes. So artificial sweeteners actually increase your insulin resistance or risk to developing diabetes. Does that make sense? Why is high fructose corn syrup referred to as poison? Did you want to answer? Go ahead.
Well, how would you get resource for understanding that topic? Dr. Roberts is a pediatric endocrinologist. I think chemistry hasn't there if you want to look at that. A good resource also is about toxicity, specifically and that matter on YouTube.
Thank you for that. Dr. Lustig is a great resource. So my understanding I'm sorry, spoke in microphone, right? My understanding of those is it depends on how they were processed. And so there's certain companies that use processing techniques that might cause inflammation, and there's others that don't. Do you guys know the brand names of the ones that are better processed? Yeah, Dr. Andrew? That's my understanding. Okay, so the ortho-organic form.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Jackson for this wonderful listening.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We would love to have you back for another lecture. I also just wanted to announce that the next lecture we have pinned out on the back table is going to be Dr. Ron talking about magnesium, which is going to be a phenomenal lecture also. There's so many chronic health concerns that are associated with magnesium deficiency. And as Dr. Jackson mentioned, because of the farming practices, all of these minerals have been farmed out of our soil. So we're not getting the mineral content that we need to be from the foods that we're eating. So I'll have flyers about that. And then also, anybody, I forgot to welcome, if anybody is new to the Riordan Clinic, if you've never been here before, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And if you have any questions, Jason, will you raise your hand? Jason will be at the back. He can answer questions, and I'm sure hopefully Dr. Jackson has a few minutes to stick around. You can ask her more questions as well. So, and we're making one more round of bulletproof coffee for anybody who wants to grab one who didn't get one on the way in. So thank you again for coming.